start off with after a song called "Sounds Like America." I do a song that my brothers and I used to do on the radio when I was about 8 years old.
He was the man in the Christmas sweater, the soft voice on Sunday night television, the face so gentle that generations of American families let him into their living rooms every December without a second thought. Nobody looked at Andy Williams and saw a businessman. They saw a crooner, a nice guy, a leftover from a gentler era of show business. But at 64 years old, when most performers his age were quietly protecting whatever nest egg they had built, Andy Williams did something that stunned the people closest to him. He took $13 million of his own money and poured it into a small town in the Ozark Hills that almost nobody in Hollywood had ever heard of. His friends back in Los Angeles thought he had finally lost his mind. 2 decades later, the numbers told a completely different story. And when his family finally added it all up, the theater, the land, the royalties, the name that still meant something 40 years after his biggest hit, the room went quiet. This is the story of how a boy from a farm town in Iowa built one of the most unlikely fortunes in American entertainment, and why it left the people who loved him in tears. Howard Andrew Williams came into the world on December 3, 1927, in Wall Lake, Iowa, a speck of a farming town where everybody's business was everybody else's business. It was not a place that produced television stars. It was a place that produced farmers, shopkeepers, and church choirs. For a boy born there, the idea of ever standing on a Hollywood stage would have sounded like a fantasy. Andy was the youngest of 6 children raised by Jay and Florence Williams, and he grew up in the company of 3 older brothers, Don, Bob, and Dick, who would end up shaping the entire direction of his life. When the family relocated east to Cheviot, Ohio, just outside Cincinnati, something shifted. Music stopped being a hobby and became the center of the household. By the time Andy was 8, he was already singing alongside his brothers in the local Presbyterian church choir. What started as simple hymns on Sunday mornings slowly turned into something more ambitious. The 4 Williams boys became a genuine singing act, the Williams Brothers Quartet, and before long they weren't performing just for their neighbors anymore. They were performing for paychecks. Radio stations in Des Moines, Chicago, and Cincinnati put them on the air. Eventually, improbably, the quartet made the leap all the way to Hollywood. For 4 brothers who had started out in a country church, that leap was staggering. And then in 1944, while Andy was still a teenager, fate handed him a moment that most professional singers never get in an entire career. He sang backing vocals on a recording that would go on to win the Academy Award for Best Original Song, Swinging on a Star, with Bing Crosby singing lead. Think about the odds stacked against a boy from Wall Lake, Iowa. There was no music industry down the road. No connections waiting to be cashed in. What the Williams family actually had was a father who pushed his sons hard, a church choir that taught them discipline, and 4 boys who learned to blend their voices with real precision. That foundation carried them out of Iowa radio booths and into a Hollywood recording session with one of the most famous entertainers alive. The Williams brothers were not a novelty act that got lucky. They were trained and they were good, and in that era, that was enough to build a career on. Then the war interrupted everything. At 17, Andy joined the United States Merchant Marine and served until World War II ended. When he came home, the brothers found a new creative partner, a woman who would leave a permanent mark on Andy's sound and his stagecraft, Kay Thompson. Thompson was a formidable presence in Hollywood, a vocal coach and arranger who had worked at MGM and later became famous in her own right as the author of the Eloise children's books. Long before that literary fame, though, she was known around town as one of the most demanding musical minds in the business. She had coached Judy Garland and Lena Horne, and she was not gentle with the Williams brothers either. The Kay Thompson and Williams Brothers nightclub act became one of the highest-paid attractions in the country. But more importantly for Andy, it became his real education. On those nightclub stages, night after night, he learned phrasing. He learned timing. He learned the almost invisible skill of holding an audience without ever seeming to try too hard. Thompson cared obsessively about control, restraint, and taste, and Andy absorbed every bit of it. The calm, unforced way he would sing for the rest of his career, never straining, never showing off, was built in those years under her guidance. Eventually, the brothers went their separate ways, and Andy stepped out as a solo act. Success did not arrive quickly. He had the talent. He had the stage experience. He had the discipline Thompson had drilled into him. What he didn't have yet was a hit that told the country who he was. That changed in 1956, the same year that shook the entire music industry to its foundation, because 1956 was also the year Elvis Presley exploded onto the national stage. Andy Williams broke through with the swing single Canadian Sunset, arriving at the exact moment rock and roll was beginning to sweep away the old world of standards, orchestras, and tuxedoed crooners. By any reasonable prediction, a singer like Andy Williams should have had a short shelf life once that new sound took over. Instead, he simply kept going. There was something in his voice, a gentle undertone of sadness, and something in his manner that people trusted. While louder, flashier stars came and went with the changing decades, Williams quietly stayed put. The hits kept arriving. Butterfly reached #1, followed by Can't Get Used to Losing You, Days of Wine and Roses, and In the Arms of Love. Across more than 5 decades as a solo performer, he would go on to record 43 albums, earning 3 platinum records and 18 gold records along the way, plus 5 Grammy nominations, though, strangely, never a competitive Grammy win. For an artist who sold that many records over that many years, it remains one of the odder footnotes of his career. What most people never think about is the other Andy Williams, the one who understood the business side of music better than almost anyone gave him credit for. He founded his own label, Barnaby Records, and the roster he built there was far more interesting than his wholesome image suggested. Barnaby put out records by the Everly Brothers, by Ray Stevens, and perhaps most surprisingly, by a young singer-songwriter named Jimmy Buffett. It's a strange image, the smooth, sweater-clad Christmas specialist quietly helping to launch the man who would later build an empire out of margaritas and beach songs. But that contradiction says a lot about who Andy Williams actually was. Softer than most stars on the surface. Sharper than almost anyone realized underneath. Most singers of his generation made their money from performing, while somebody else controlled the records, the venues, and the publishing rights. Williams moved in a different direction. He built a label in the 1960s. Decades later, he would build a theater. And around that theater, he would buy real estate. He understood something that took many performers a lifetime, or an entire fortune lost, to learn. A performer gets paid, but an owner keeps earning long after the applause dies down. In 1961, composer Henry Mancini and lyricist Johnny Mercer wrote a quiet, aching little song for Audrey Hepburn to sing on a fire escape in Breakfast at Tiffany's. The song was Moon River. Andy Williams performed it at the 1962 Academy Awards, the night it won Best Original Song, and from that moment forward the song became permanently attached to his name. Here is the detail that surprises almost everyone who hears it. Andy Williams never released Moon River as a single in the United States. The actual hit single belonged to Jerry Butler. Williams simply performed it, recorded it on an album, and made it the theme song of his television show. And somehow that was enough. The bond between the man and the song became so powerful that 30 years later, when he built his own theater, he named it after those 2 words. When he died, Moon River appeared in nearly every headline written about him. He owned the song in the public imagination without ever needing it to top the charts, which, if you think about it, is a rarer and stranger kind of success than simply having a #1 hit. The song fit him because it asked for exactly what he had spent years learning to give: warmth, restraint, and control, with nothing forced. A singer with too much power in his voice could have crushed a song that delicate. Williams let it breathe. His television career deepened that connection even further. The Andy Williams Show ran on NBC from 1962 to 1971 and won 3 Emmy Awards. His Christmas specials became a fixture of American holiday life, with Williams appearing year after year in his now iconic sweater, singing about the most wonderful time of the year. That single image outlived the show itself and became the picture most people still carry of him. The show also helped launch other performers, most notably the Osmond Brothers, who became national stars largely because of the exposure Williams gave them. President Ronald Reagan would later call Andy Williams a national treasure, and decades after the show ended, the Osmonds themselves would return to sing at his memorial. Williams had a dry sense of humor about the punishing pace of that decade. Looking back on the 1960s, he once joked that his memories of the era were a blur, not because of drugs, he was quick to clarify, but because of the schedule he had put himself through. It's a fitting line for a man whose version of the 1960s wasn't rebellion. It was relentless motion, recording, touring, hosting, building. Andy Williams was a lifelong Republican, and in his later years, he spoke openly about politics, at one point accusing President Obama of leaning toward Marxist ideas. But his political life was never as simple as a single label suggests. He admitted to experimenting with LSD. He publicly opposed the Nixon administration's attempt to deport John Lennon in the 1970s. And in 1968, he became one of the most visible public supporters of Robert F. Kennedy's presidential campaign, not out of political calculation, but because Kennedy was one of his closest friends. On June 5, 1968, just hours after winning the California Democratic primary, Robert Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles. He died the next day. At Kennedy's funeral, Andy Williams stood and sang the battle hymn of the Republic. He later explained that the song had been chosen because Kennedy had used it constantly on the campaign trail. Kennedy, Williams said, had a genuinely terrible singing voice, but he loved that song anyway. What Williams said about how he made it through that performance is one of the most striking things he ever revealed about himself. He told himself in that moment that this was simply his job, that he could not let his own grief get in the way of the song he owed his friend. To get through it, he had to actively push the thought of Kennedy out of his mind while he sang over his coffin. In his own words, he concentrated on not thinking about him at all. That single sentence says almost everything about who Andy Williams was underneath the sweater and the smile. He was standing in a church, singing over the body of a murdered friend, in front of a grieving family and a stunned nation, and he turned his own pain into an act of duty. He gave the song everything, because the song was the last thing he had left to give. That same instinct would resurface again and again throughout his life, during the media storm that would soon engulf his own family in Aspen, and decades later, when he faced his own mortality and chose to announce it from stage, rather than through a press release, promising his audience he would see them again the following season. 44 years after Kennedy's funeral, at Andy Williams' own memorial service in Branson, Robert Kennedy's widow, Ethel Kennedy, sent a video tribute. She recalled a single dance the two of them had once shared and how she had swooned. A small memory, but one that carried the weight of an entire friendship inside it. Now comes the part of the story that still catches people off guard and reveals Andy Williams more clearly than any song or television special ever could. In December 1961, Williams married Claudine Longuette, a French-born singer, actress, and former Las Vegas showgirl he had met while she was performing on the Strip. Born in Paris in January 1942, Longuette quickly became part of the television image America associated with her husband. Together, they had 3 children, Noel, Christian, and Robert, and on screen, the family looked like a Christmas card come to life. The famous singer, the beautiful wife, the children who appeared alongside them on his NBC specials. But Longuette was never simply Andy Williams' wife. She built a career of her own, recording soft pop albums for A&M Records, singing Nothing to Lose opposite Peter Sellers in Blake Edwards' 1968 film The Party, and appearing in television series including McHale's Navy, Dr. Kildare, Hogan's Heroes, Combat, and 12 O'Clock High. For a while, from the outside, everything about the marriage looked polished and enviable. Then it began to fall apart. Williams and Longuette separated in 1970, and the divorce was finalized in 1975. Even so, the two remained close, and their family did not simply dissolve along with the marriage. After the split, Longuette moved to Aspen, Colorado, with the children, settling into the Starwood District chalet belonging to her boyfriend, professional skier Vladimir "Spider" Sabic. Sabic was no ordinary boyfriend. He was a genuine sporting celebrity, having competed for the United States at the 1968 Winter Olympics and gone on to become the top earner on the professional ski circuit in the early 1970s. Many people believed he had served as the inspiration for Robert Redford's character in the 1969 film Downhill Racer. Longuette and Sabic had met in 1972 at a celebrity ski exhibition in Bear Valley, California, and by 1976 their relationship was a fixture of Aspen's social scene. Then, on March 21, 1976, everything changed inside the bathroom of that chalet. Claudine Longuette shot Spider Sabic with a .22 caliber pistol that had originally been purchased by Sabic's own father. The bullet struck him once in the abdomen. He lost a tremendous amount of blood before an ambulance could reach the house, and Longuette rode with him to Aspen Valley Hospital. He died on the way, at 31 years old. Longuette was 34. Her explanation was simple. It was an accident. She testified that Sabic had been showing her how the gun worked when it discharged, and that the weapon had never been pointed at him, that it had simply been resting flat in her palm. The prosecution painted a far darker picture. Friends of Sabic told reporters he had been planning to ask Longuette to move out, and that the relationship had grown deeply strained. Autopsy findings reportedly suggested Savage had been facing away and bent over when the shot was fired. Longuet had also kept a personal diary describing the relationship as troubled, and investigators had collected a blood sample, but because police failed to obtain a proper search warrant, both pieces of evidence were later ruled inadmissible in court. Longuet was charged with reckless manslaughter, a charge carrying a potential 10-year sentence. In January 1977, the jury instead convicted her of the far lesser charge of criminally negligent homicide, a misdemeanor. Her sentence amounted to 2 years of probation, a small fine, and 30 days in jail. Savage's family later filed a $1.3 million civil suit, which was settled out of court on the condition that Longuet would never speak publicly about Savage or his death again, a promise she kept for the rest of her life. By then, the case had already become a national spectacle. Saturday Night Live mocked it in a sketch. Reporters tracked every twist of the trial. And through all of it, the arrest, the trial, the tabloid frenzy, Andy Williams stayed by her side. He supported her publicly, walked with her to the courthouse, and quietly took over the care of their 3 children while giving the press almost nothing to work with. That choice cost him something real. At the time, Williams was one of the most wholesome names in American entertainment, the Christmas Sweater Man, the Family Hour host, the singer a sitting president would later praise as a national treasure. His ex-wife had just killed an Olympic athlete, and the entire country was watching. Most stars in his position would have distanced themselves from the courtroom entirely. Williams walked straight into it beside her, and that decision followed him for the rest of his life. Even decades later, after a 70-year career, 3 Emmys, 18 gold records, and a presidential compliment, retrospectives of his life still could not resist mentioning the Aspen shooting in their headlines. Williams never seemed to complain publicly about that. He never turned on Longuet either, whatever he privately believed about what happened in that bathroom. He carried it quietly, in large part, it seems, for the sake of the 3 children who had once appeared beside their parents on network Christmas specials and had suddenly become the children of the most talked-about defendant in America. Claudine Longuet later married Ronald Austin, reportedly one of her own defense attorneys, in 1985, and lived quietly and privately for decades afterward. She died on May 14, 2026, at the age of 84, 50 years after Aspen, having never once broken her silence about the case. Her nephew, who announced her passing, made no mention of it either, choosing instead to remember her light, her elegance, and the love she left behind. After his television show ended in 1971, Andy Williams went back on the road, and for years his Christmas tours remained a powerful seasonal draw. But touring in his 60s was wearing him down in ways it never had before. One night in Des Moines finally made the decision for him. A snowstorm kept much of his audience away, and then his band's equipment failed to arrive in time for the next show in Chicago, forcing his musicians to borrow instruments from a local high school band just to get through the performance. For Williams, that was the final straw. His response, according to those who knew him, was blunt and final: no more tours. Instead, he did something almost nobody around him expected. He looked toward Branson, Missouri, a small Ozark town that liked to call itself the live entertainment capital of the country, filled with theaters built around country music, comedy acts, and magic shows. Where most of his Hollywood peers saw a backwater, Williams saw an opportunity nobody else in the industry had spotted. In 1992, at 64 years old, he built the Andy Williams Moon River Theater, sinking $13 million of his own money into the project and helping design the building himself. At an age when most entertainers were carefully protecting whatever they had already earned, Williams was placing a serious, uncertain bet on a town his closest friends in Los Angeles simply didn't understand. The result looked unlike anything else in Branson. Architectural Digest even featured it, a building designed to blend into the surrounding hills, with a man-made Moon River curving gently around its entrance. The theater opened on May 1, 1992, and Williams went straight to work, 2 shows a night, 6 days a week, 9 months out of the year, a schedule he maintained until his final years, when he finally scaled back to single nightly show. His old Hollywood friends were baffled. In 1998, he told the Associated Press that most of his friends in L.A. still thought he was nuts for having moved out there. They had badly misjudged the move. Before Williams arrived, Branson was known primarily as a country music town. His theater helped reshape the entire character of the place, drawing a new kind of audience and, in turn, new kinds of performers. Over the following 2 decades, Williams shared his Moon River stage with Petula Clark, Glenn Campbell, Charo, the Osmond brothers, and the Lennon sisters, and the theater itself became one of the most visited attractions in the entire region. This is the part of the story that explains everything. By the 1990s, Andy Williams' record royalties had slowed considerably, and his television career had ended years earlier. The steady money, the real foundation of his fortune, came from the theater itself, ticket sales, the Christmas shows, and the real estate that grew up around the property. At 64, Williams had grasped something that eludes most performers their entire careers. An artist who owns the venue owns far more than a stage. He owns the room, the schedule, the box office, and every dollar value the show creates around it. The math behind that bet is staggering when you actually run it. 2 shows a night, 6 nights a week, 9 months a year works out to roughly 430 performances annually, a pace that would exhaust a performer half his age. Williams sustained it well into his 70s. Over 2 decades, that adds up to somewhere close to 8,000 performances. A touring act typically surrenders a huge share of its earnings to promoters, venues, transportation, and logistics. Williams had built something fundamentally different. The audience came to him. The stage never moved. There was no equipment to lose in a snowstorm ever again. He had also built the entire business around the one asset no one could take from him, Christmas itself. Since the 1960s, his holiday specials had become a genuine piece of American family tradition, and in Branson, the Christmas season became the anchor of the Moon River Theater's entire year. Families returned again and again because Williams had spent decades quietly making his voice synonymous with that particular feeling of the season. For the first time in his career, he owned the physical room where people came to experience that connection. And the effect rippled outward. Before Andy Williams, Branson had a narrow, almost provincial reputation. After him, it became a far broader entertainment market capable of supporting acts well beyond the country circuit that had defined it. He built a theater, and the theater reshaped an entire town's economy around it. In November 2011, during a Christmas concert in Branson, Andy Williams stood on the stage he had built with his own money and told his audience, plainly, that he had been diagnosed with bladder cancer. He also told them he intended to keep performing. True to form, he did not release the news through a publicist or a carefully arranged television sit-down. At 83 years old, he simply told the people who had bought tickets to see him, in the room he owned, on the night it happened. Through the early months of 2012, a spokesperson for the Moon River Theater reported that Williams was in good spirits and growing stronger by the week, with plans already in motion for his return to the stage that September. He never made it back. Andy Williams died on the night of September 25, 2012, at his home in Branson, Missouri, following a year-long battle with bladder cancer. He was 84 years old. He was survived by his second wife, Debbie, the former Debbie Haas, whom he had married in 1991, and with whom he had split his time between Branson and Palm Springs. He was also survived by his 3 children with Claudine Longuette, Robert, Noel, and Christian. His memorial was held at the Moon River Theater on October 21, 2012. What had originally been planned as a private gathering opened up to the public once word spread through Branson, and more than 1,000 people came to say goodbye. Peter Marshall hosted the service. The Osmond brothers, Jay, Merrill, and Jimmy, sang just as they had once sung on his television show decades earlier. Bob Newhart spoke and, by most accounts, broke down while doing it. Video tributes arrived from Bill Cosby and from Ethel Kennedy. The service closed the way his own shows had closed for decades, with his own familiar sign-off, spoken one last time, on his behalf. May each day of your life be a good day and good night. Then the theater lights went dark. What Andy Williams left behind was never just a stack of gold records or a shelf of Emmy Awards. It was a working theater still drawing crowds to a town he had helped put on the map, a piece of real estate empire built quietly and deliberately over 30 years, and a family who, when they finally sat down and totaled up everything the boy from Wall Lake, Iowa, had actually built, found the number almost impossible to believe.